So welcome back to week 3, topic 2, globalization, policy axes. So in the previous topic, we looked at what globalization is. And in this topic, we're going to look more closely about how globalization processes affect policy actors and also the policy-making process. So policy actors are individuals or groups which influence or shape policy. And there's 3 key spheres in which actors operate. So there's the state, there's the private sector, and there's also civil society. Globalization empowers essentially some actors at the expense of others. And we have 2 theories about how this is occurring. So the first one is that globalization has resulted in the emergence of a more pluralist society. And the second theory is that there's been a concentration of power in each of these spheres, creating an elite number of actors to influence policy in unprecedented ways. So let's first look more closely at that first theory, the idea that a pluralist society has emerged as a result of globalization processes. So the information age has facilitated a more open, highly dynamic network structure, which has reorganized power relationships. And this process of globalization is democratizing. So the argument is that there's new spaces for a range of actors and interconnections between them. So you can see, for example, in my rudimentary diagram on the right here, that I've tried to kind of represent a network and the connections between them. So in the past, people that had perhaps marginalized views or views that were different from the norm tended to be quite isolated. But due to new communication technologies, these people are now able to contact and connect with each other, and in doing so are able then to take a much more active role in the policy making process. So here we can see, for example, that the red dots might represent one particular issue that those people can then interconnect. So can the orange dots, so can the blue dots, and so can the green dots. And the argument is then that a more pluralist society with more dispersed power has enabled then different people to participate in the policy process that really didn't have a platform to participate previously. The second theory is that there's been an increasing concentration of power. So in the past, we've always had essentially governments in democratically nations at least. We've had governments who've had the bulk of power and authority in society. But their power has also always been balanced by an accountability to citizens. So essentially, governments make rules and laws and regulations. But if those regulations and laws are unpopular, then when it comes around to voting, citizens vote them out and vote someone else in. So there's a balance and a check, if you like, on government power. However, what's since happened is that an exclusive global elite has now emerged, which has what we call unrivaled power, because it doesn't have any accountability to those that it affects. And we're specifically talking about transnational corporations. And as a result of this, as a result of diminishing power in government, but growing power in the private sector, individuals can feel perhaps disempowered by globalizing forces and the changes that are occurring in society in many ways. So essentially, we have winners and losers as a result of globalization. We have the state, who in this sense at least is a loser. So national governments have increasingly less power to address health issues, and this is due to a variety of reasons. The first is that governments are now hindered by the need to do trade in an increasingly globalized world. So they're tied to World Trade Organization agreements or agreements with other trade agreements with other countries that harmonize trading rules and impede them from acting in particular ways. And in addition, as I mentioned earlier, the rising power of the transnational corporation means that they have a lot of power because they represent a lot of revenue and in any particular country. And part of this power as well and part of the declining power that governments have is the fact that transnational corporations are able to set their head offices in countries with lower tax regimes. So Ireland, for example, charges 10% corporate tax compared to Australia that charges 30% and more. So as a result of this, transnational corporations are able to receive revenue from a particular country, but declare that turnover revenue in a lower tax country, meaning that they pay relatively little or no tax in the country where that revenue is being generated. And as a result of this, governments have declining revenue from businesses. The private sector is also a winner. So there's increased concentration of ownership in areas of production in industrial sectors. And because of that concentration of ownership, due to the necessity to be able to compete in a very globalized marketplace with goods that are highly competitively priced, this has created individual mega companies, or what we call these transnational corporations. And the transnational corporations have gained some of the powers monopolized by the state. And we can start to look at this now when we look at the pharmaceutical industry. So typically, large transnational conglomerates or corporations have head offices in one nation. They might do their research and development in another country, and their manufacturing in other countries again, or in subsidiaries scattered across the globe. And the ascendancy of the pharmaceutical industry to shape health policy has been manifest in several ways. So the first one is that as a massive conglomerate with increasing levels of power, the pharmaceutical industry has been well placed to lobby for things that matter to it, for its own interests. And one of the interests that is particularly crucial to pharmaceutical companies is intellectual property rights. So some drugs, for example, can take up to 20 years to develop before they're put to market and start returning revenue to a company. So it's in the interests of pharmaceutical corporations to have longer patents and to have monopolies on test data, because it protects their research and development, or so the argument goes. So essentially, head offices for transnational pharmaceutical corporations are situated in the United States, or they're in the European Union or Japan, because these particular countries have stronger intellectual property protections. Or alternatively, they will be situated in countries which have lower corporate taxes, so they can avoid paying huge amounts of tax. The pharmaceutical industry has attempted to achieve globalization of intellectual property protections. So in 1995, there was some global agreement around trade-related aspects of intellectual property, and the pharmaceutical industry was very influential in shaping some of those agreements. But it also takes part in, particularly through the US, has taken part or influenced policy on trade agreements. So for example, in Australia, we have the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, which pretty much ensures a monopoly of medications, because the medications that are available in the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme are subsidised. Those that aren't are not subsidised. Therefore, in the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement in 2003-4, for example, the pharmaceutical corporations in the US lobbied to try and ensure that in that trade agreement that that monopoly would be ended, because it was considered uncompetitive practices, because it means that they can't flood the market with their own brands and products if they're not already approved by the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. And similar attempts were made again in the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2010. To my knowledge, none of them was successful, but it does show the power of the growing power of industry to influence policy in ways that maintain their own interests. So when we look at civil society, we see in civil society actors are also winners in a globalizing world. So we have transnational advocacy groups that are able to reframe global debates and shape policy agenda and gain leverage over big business in a number of ways. One of them is boycotting products and or naming and shaming. So, for example, some advocacy groups have been really effective at bringing around better worker health and safety standards, particularly in developing nations, due to naming and shaming those particular brands and stores that use these poor work practices. And as a result of this ability to name and shame, there's been a growing trend towards more voluntary codes of practice. So an example of that might be the Australian Advertising Association, which has a voluntary code of practice around advertising to children. We've also seen that advocacy groups and civil society have encouraged legal changes and have been able to do this through mass media. For example, the lockout laws came about as a result of a lot of media coverage, which was perpetuated through social media and gained traction, which meant that the state government was placed in a position where it was expected to do something. And that's the impetus for the lockout laws and for curbing, if you like, alcohol-fueled violence. Advocacy groups and other actors in civil society have also been quite successful at challenging normative but oppressive behaviours. So, for example, there's been quite a lot of success in the women's movement, framing debates against violence and reproductive health, particularly in developing nations, and even in developed nations around sexual abuse. So, for example, the Me Too movement hashtag, which started in the US, as a hashtag that's been used in 30-odd countries worldwide. It's become a worldwide phenomenon. But it's also started in the film and entertainment industry and now has crossed into multiple fields. So it's in people of sexual abuse and sexual harassment has been called out in music industry, in politics, and even in medicine, with some junior doctors now challenging surgeons who expect sexual favours in return for good reports and career progression. Of course, there's a negative to this more open, interconnected society, and that's that civil society is not always civil. So at the same time as people have been able to connect and raise awareness of good causes and bring about changes, we've also seen a growth in transport of criminal networks, such as drug trafficking, human slavery, and so on and so forth. So in summary then, Lee, Buce and Festukian conclude that the drivers of globalisation, which are essentially communication technologies, open up policy to the influence of a wider spectrum of actors. And the winners in this case are the private sector and civil society. National governments, on the other hand, are seeing their powers weakened through globalisation processes. However, it will be incorrect to think that the private sector and civil society have equal influence on health policy making. So as Bauman, a famous sociologist, argues, new forms of elitism and exclusivity are being created. So we've seen the emergence of a new transnational managerial class who are amongst the most powerful actors and who have increasing influence in policy decision making. The Director General of WHO has regular roundtables with the pharmaceutical industry, for example. And we also see in the private sector that they're being increasingly approached by government and people in positions of power because they hold the technical expertise and resources which they've gained and have been facilitated by globalisation processes. And this allows the private sector to be invited in to define and solve policy problems. So in this sense, for example, in a health and healthcare perspective, we've seen the emergence of public and private partnerships. Particularly one example that springs to mind is the North Shore Hospital, which is a public and private partnership run jointly by, I think, built by the private sector and will pass over into public hands in 20 years. So we'll look at these issues in more detail later in the unit, but that summarises the implications of globalisation for policy actors and the policy process. Thanks for listening, See you next week. Bye-bye.